Officer Sarah Mitchell had been patrolling the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Portland, Oregon for nearly 8 years. She knew every street, every corner, every neighbor who waved hello during her morning shifts. Dakota, her German Shepherd partner of 5 years, sat alert beside her in the patrol car, his intelligent eyes constantly scanning the streets they traveled. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early March, the kind of day where the spring sun was just beginning to warm the lingering winter chill. The radio had been quiet for most of the day, just the usual minor traffic incidents and welfare checks that came with the territory of neighborhood policing. At 1:47 p.m., the radio crackled to life with an urgency that made Sarah's instincts immediately heighten. Dispatch reported a call from a concerned neighbor at 2847 Maple Street, a modest single-family home in a well-kept residential area. The caller, a Mrs., reported hearing intense screaming, both male and female voices, from the property. She had initially hesitated to call, not wanting to interfere in what might be a private family matter, but the escalating volume and the sound of breaking glass had finally prompted her to contact authorities. Dispatch classified it as a potential domestic disturbance with possible child involvement. Sarah's heart rate increased immediately. Child involvement changed everything. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, Sarah responded calmly into her radio. "En route to 2847 Maple Street, ETA 4 minutes. "Copy, Unit 12, backup being dispatched, exercise caution." Sarah activated her lights and sirens, merging carefully into traffic. Dakota immediately sensed the shift in urgency. His ears perked up, and he repositioned himself, ready for whatever lay ahead. Sarah had learned long ago to trust her K-9 partner's instincts. Dakota had an uncanny ability to sense human emotions and intentions, something that would prove invaluable in the coming minutes and hours. 3 minutes later, Sarah pulled onto Maple Street and immediately spotted the house. It was a modest 2-story colonial-style home with a well-maintained front yard and a detached garage. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the flower beds recently planted with spring bulbs. From the outside, it looked like any other peaceful suburban home in Portland. But as Sarah stepped out of her vehicle, Dakota at her side, she could hear the raised voices coming from inside. A man's voice, deep and angry, was shouting something unintelligible. Then came a woman's voice, higher-pitched and equally frantic, followed by what sounded like a child crying. Not the normal crying of a fussy toddler, but the raw, terrified wailing of a child in genuine distress. Sarah approached the front door carefully, her training kicking in automatically. She could feel her adrenaline pumping through her veins. Dakota walked beside her, his body tense but controlled. The German Shepherd had been trained extensively in crisis situations and knew how to remain calm regardless of what they might encounter. Sarah pressed the doorbell and knocked firmly on the door. "Police, open the door," she called out authoritatively. The voices inside immediately stopped. For a moment there was an eerie silence. Then slowly the front door opened. A man in his mid-30s stood in the doorway, his face flushed red, his dark hair disheveled. He was breathing heavily, and Sarah could immediately sense his agitation. Behind him, she could see the interior of the house, and it was chaos. A lamp lay on its side on the hardwood floor, its shade crumpled. Magazines were scattered everywhere. Pictures on the wall hung at odd angles. "Sir, I'm Officer Mitchell with Portland Police. I received a report of a disturbance at this address. May I come inside?" Sarah's voice was calm and professional, though her eyes were already scanning the visible interior for signs of danger or injury. The man hesitated for just a moment. "Everything's fine," he said, his voice still tense. "We were just having a disagreement, nothing serious." "I still need to come inside and assess the situation," Sarah said firmly. It wasn't a request. She gently guided Dakota forward, and the man stepped back reluctantly. What Sarah saw inside made her stomach tighten. The living room was indeed in disarray. Beyond the scattered items, Sarah caught sight of something that made her protective instincts surge. A small figure, barely 3 feet tall, huddled behind the corner of a large sectional couch. A child. A little girl, no more than 3 or 4 years old, with curly hair and tear-stained cheeks, was trembling violently, her small arms wrapped around herself protectively. "That's my daughter," the man said quickly. "Emma, she's just upset because—" "Sir, I need you to step back," Sarah interrupted, her voice taking on an edge of command. She approached the child slowly, deliberately, aware that her sudden movements could terrify the already frightened girl. "Hi there, sweetheart," Sarah said gently, lowering herself to a non-threatening posture. "My name is Officer Sarah. This is my friend Dakota. We're here to help." Emma's eyes, wide and filled with fear, fixed on Dakota. The German shepherd, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, approached with exceptional gentleness. He didn't jump or bark. Instead, he simply lay down on the floor at a respectful distance from the trembling child, his dark eyes soft and sympathetic. His massive frame, which could appear intimidating to some, seemed to somehow convey nothing but calm reassurance to the frightened girl. Sarah's mind was racing through the possibilities. The man identified himself as Emma's father. He explained that Emma's mother, Jennifer, had violated their custody agreement by keeping Emma longer than scheduled. He claimed that when he came to pick up Emma at the designated time and location, Jennifer had refused to return her. He had become increasingly frustrated and had come to the house. When Emma saw him angry, she had become frightened and upset. The situation had escalated from there. "Where is Jennifer?" Sarah asked, still watching Emma carefully. The child's breathing was beginning to slow slightly as she watched Dakota's calm, steady presence. "In the bedroom upstairs," said. "She called the police on me." Sarah radioed for backup to ensure the situation remained secure, then carefully made her way upstairs, leaving Dakota with Emma. In the upstairs bedroom, she found a woman in her early 30s, Jennifer, Emma's mother. Jennifer was shaken but appeared physically unharmed. She quickly explained her version of events, had shown up unexpectedly, angry and threatening. When she tried to close the door, he had forced his way inside. Emma had witnessed the confrontation and had become terrified. Jennifer had grabbed Emma and retreated to the bedroom, locking the door before calling police. It was a classic case of custody dispute escalating to something more serious. But what troubled Sarah most was the look in Emma's eyes. That wasn't just fear of a momentary conflict between parents. That was the kind of deep, primal terror that spoke of something more complex, something that went deeper than a single afternoon's incident. There was trauma there, old trauma, not fresh. By the time backup arrived and the situation was brought under control, Sarah had made mental notes of every detail. Emma refused to speak to anyone. She followed Dakota with her eyes but remained silent, her small body still trembling. As Sarah documented the scene and began the process of filing reports, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case was far from over. Something dark lurked beneath the surface of this family dispute, and little Emma, with her terrified silence, held the key to understanding what it was. The 2 weeks following the incident on Maple Street were among the most frustrating of Sarah Mitchell's policing career. She had submitted her initial report, documented everything meticulously, and hoped that the situation would be resolved quickly through the proper channels. Child Protective Services had become involved, and both Jennifer and were assigned separate caseworkers. However, as the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn into the case, unable to shake the haunting image of little Emma's terrified face from her mind. The first interview with social services occurred at their downtown office. Doctor, a seasoned child psychologist with 20 years of experience, had been assigned to Emma's case. Sarah attended the interview in an unofficial capacity, hoping her presence might provide some comfort to the traumatized child. The waiting room was intentionally designed to be child-friendly, with colorful murals of animals and nature scenes on the walls. Picture books were scattered on low shelves. Soft music played in the background. Despite all these carefully orchestrated comforting elements, Emma sat rigidly on her mother's lap, her small fingers gripping Jennifer's sleeve as though her life depended on it. Doctor knelt down to Emma's level, her voice warm and inviting. "Hi, Emma. My name is Doctor. I'm a doctor who likes to talk to children. Would you like to sit with me for a little bit? We can draw pictures if you want, or we can just talk about your favorite things." Emma's response was complete and utter silence. She didn't shake her head. She didn't nod. She didn't even acknowledge that she had heard the question. Her eyes, which had briefly flickered with recognition when she first saw Officer Sarah in the waiting room, now stared fixedly at the floor. "It's okay," Doctor said gently, straightening up. She looked at Jennifer questioningly. "Has Emma been speaking at all since the incident?" Jennifer's voice was filled with concern and frustration. "Not much. A few words to my mother, but mostly she just shuts down. She hasn't been to since that day. I tried on Monday, but when we got to the door, she had a complete panic attack. She was screaming, hyperventilating. I've never seen her like this." What followed was a pattern that would repeat itself countless times over the next 2 weeks. Social workers, child psychologists, and police detectives would attempt to interview Emma, each one using their own specialized techniques and training. Some tried gentle questioning. Others used play therapy, allowing Emma to act out scenarios with dolls and toys, hoping she would reveal what happened through her play. Child development specialists spoke about the therapeutic benefits of creative expression, offering Emma art supplies and asking her to draw pictures of her family, her home, or anything she felt like creating. Nothing worked. Emma would sit quietly, sometimes for hours, and simply refuse to engage. Occasionally she would draw something, usually just random lines or scribbles, but she never provided any meaningful communication. When directly asked about what happened at her father's house, about the yelling, about the broken lamp, she would retreat further into herself, sometimes even holding her breath until her face turned slightly red. Detective James, a gruff but compassionate investigator with 15 years of experience, sat in the police station's break room one afternoon, frustration etched into every line of his weathered face. He had worked countless child abuse cases, domestic violence situations, and custody disputes. He understood the complexity of family law and the challenges of protecting children when the evidence was ambiguous. But this case was particularly maddening because they had a victim who could potentially provide crucial testimony, and that victim had essentially locked herself away behind an impenetrable wall of silence and trauma. "The girl's a ghost," he told Officer Sarah during one of their informal conversations about the case. "She's there physically, but mentally, she's somewhere else entirely. Until we can get her to talk, we've got nothing concrete." His lawyer is already arguing that the whole incident was just a parental disagreement that got out of hand. He's claiming Jennifer is manipulating Emma, coaching her to make false accusations. Without Emma's direct testimony, without something concrete beyond, he yelled, "I don't know how we prove anything in court." Sarah understood the predicament completely. In her experience, many child abuse cases were prosecuted based on physical evidence, bruises, injuries, medical records, but Emma showed no signs of physical abuse. She was clean, well-fed, properly clothed. There were no broken bones, no suspicious injuries. All they had were behavioral indicators: the child's extreme trauma response, her refusal to speak, her apparent terror when confronted with situations involving her father. Legally, those factors alone weren't sufficient to build an unassailable case. By the end of the first week, Emma's therapist, a compassionate woman named Dr. Lisa, had documented extensive notes about the child's condition. Emma was exhibiting classic trauma symptoms, nightmares so severe that Jennifer said she was waking up screaming in the middle of the night, regressive behaviors, including despite being successfully potty-trained months earlier, selective mutism, the apparent inability or unwillingness to speak in certain situations, and severe separation anxiety from her mother, refusing to let Jennifer out of her sight even for brief moments. "This child has experienced something deeply traumatic," Doctor wrote in her clinical notes. Her presentation is consistent with acute stress disorder and possible complex trauma. However, without direct communication from the child regarding the source of her trauma, it remains difficult to determine the exact nature of what occurred. The second week brought a temporary protective custody order that restricted contact with Emma to supervised visitation only. This was meant to be a precautionary measure, a way to ensure Emma's immediate safety while the investigation proceeded. However, even this decision was based more on the principle of erring on the side of caution rather than on concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Jennifer felt partially vindicated but profoundly frustrated. She knew in her heart that had done something to Emma, that his emotional intensity and controlling behavior had traumatized their daughter. But knowing something and proving it were two entirely different things in the legal system. She found herself in an exhausting limbo, caring for a deeply damaged child while simultaneously trying to navigate a complex legal process that moved with agonizing slowness. Meanwhile, maintained his innocence through his attorney. He argued that Emma's selective mutism was a response to her mother's parental alienation, not to anything he had done. He claimed that Jennifer was deliberately keeping Emma from him and poisoning her against him. He demanded his visitation rights be restored. His attorney filed motion after motion, each one adding layers of legal complexity to an already tangled situation. By the end of the second week, the case had reached a critical impasse. A preliminary custody hearing was scheduled for the following month, but everyone involved, Sarah, Detective, Dr. Jennifer, even's own attorney, knew that the hearing would be essentially meaningless without Emma's testimony. Her silence had become the case's greatest obstacle. She held the truth inside her traumatized mind, locked away behind emotional walls that no amount of professional intervention seemed able to penetrate. Time was running out. Emma's continued to deteriorate, and still she would not speak. Detective James sat alone in his office on a Friday evening, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the mountain of case files stacked on his desk. Outside his window, Portland's downtown skyline glowed against the darkening sky. He should have gone home hours ago. His wife had texted him twice asking when he'd be back. He had ignored both messages. This was the curse of his profession. There was always one more case that demanded attention, one more file that needed review, one more puzzle that refused to be solved. Emma's file lay open in front of him, the accumulated evidence of 3 weeks of investigation contained in a relatively thin folder. For a case that had consumed so much of his mental energy, the actual documentation was disappointingly sparse. There were the initial police reports, the social services intake forms, doctors' clinical notes about Emma's selective mutism, Jennifer's account of events, denials, and numerous legal documents related to the custody dispute. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that would hold up convincingly in a courtroom without Emma's direct testimony. James rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in his chair. At 52 years old, he had been a detective for 23 years. He had worked child abuse cases that still haunted his nightmares, cases of terrible physical abuse, sexual exploitation, and systematic neglect. Those cases, horrible as they were, often contained the physical evidence necessary for prosecution. Photographs of injuries, medical reports, forensic evidence. But this case was different. This was psychological abuse, emotional manipulation, something equally damaging but infinitely harder to prove. And at the center of it all was a 4-year-old girl who had decided, perhaps subconsciously, that the world was no longer safe enough for her to use her voice. He stood up and walked to the break room, pouring himself a cup of coffee that had been sitting in the pot since early afternoon. It was bitter and lukewarm, but he drank it anyway. As he stood there, staring blankly at the refrigerator covered in family photos and case reminders, his mind drifted to something he had read recently. He had been up late one night, unable to sleep due to the Emma case, and he had found himself watching a documentary about therapy animals. Specifically about how dogs, service dogs, therapy dogs, emotional support animals, could reach people that traditional therapy sometimes could not. There had been a case featured in that documentary about a child who had completely shut down after witnessing a traumatic event. A trained therapy dog had been brought in, and over weeks of carefully monitored sessions, the child had begun to open up. Not to humans, but to the dog. The child would talk to the dog, confide in the dog, express emotions to the dog that she had been unable to express to any person, no matter how well-trained or compassionate that person might be. There was something about the non-judgmental, completely present nature of a dog that bypassed the psychological defenses that a traumatized child had erected. James returned to his desk and immediately began searching online for more information about therapy animals and their effectiveness with traumatized children. Hours passed. He read academic papers, watched video interviews with animal behaviorists and child psychologists, and looked into case studies from around the country. The more he read, the more convinced he became that this might be worth exploring. But there was a problem. This wasn't standard police procedure. Using a therapy animal to facilitate a child's testimony was not protocol. It was unconventional, possibly even controversial. There would be legal questions about admissibility, about whether statements made in the presence of a therapy dog could be considered reliable evidence. Defense attorneys would immediately challenge the methodology. But what did they have to lose? They had nothing now. Emma's silence meant they had no case at all. Saturday morning, James made a decision. He pulled up Officer Sarah Mitchell's contact information and called her cell phone. They had worked together on several cases over the years and had developed a mutual respect and trust. If anyone would understand what he was thinking, it would be Sarah. She answered on the third ring, her voice initially cautious but warming when she heard who it was. "Sarah, it's Detective. I know this is unusual, but I need to talk to you about something. Do you have some time this afternoon?" They met at a small coffee shop near the precinct that afternoon. Sarah arrived with Dakota, her K-9 partner, as she often did on her days off. The German Shepherd was perfectly behaved, lying quietly beneath their table as they discussed the case. James ordered a black coffee and a pastry he wasn't particularly hungry for. Sarah got a cappuccino and sat across from him, her blue eyes attentive and slightly curious. "I've been thinking about Emma," James began, carefully laying out his concerns. "We've hit a complete dead end with traditional investigation methods. She won't talk to anyone, not social workers, not psychologists, not police. And without her testimony, we don't have a case. Lawyer will tear apart anything we try to prosecute based on circumstantial evidence alone." Sarah nodded, understanding his frustration. She had been following the case's progress, or lack thereof, and shared his concern about the trapped child. "What I'm about to suggest," James continued, "is completely unconventional. It's not standard protocol. It will probably face legal challenges. But I've been reading about the effectiveness of therapy animals with traumatized children, and I think Dakota might be able to help where everyone else has failed." He explained his idea carefully. Bring Emma into a neutral, comfortable environment. Have Sarah present with Dakota, not as a police officer conducting an interrogation, but simply as a companion with a gentle animal. Sometimes, James theorized, children who have been traumatized by adults can more easily communicate with animals. They don't carry the authority, the judgment, or the potential for further harm that adults represent. A dog simply listens. A dog doesn't have an agenda. A dog's presence can sometimes create a bridge that human intervention cannot. Sarah listened thoughtfully, her hand occasionally reaching down to stroke Dakota's soft fur as she considered the proposal. She understood the logic, and she had experienced firsthand how powerfully Dakota could affect traumatized individuals. She had seen people calm down immediately when Dakota approached them. She had witnessed the dog's almost supernatural ability to sense emotional distress and respond with appropriate gentleness. "It's risky," she said finally. "If word gets out that we're using unconventional methods, it could undermine any case we build. Defense attorneys will have a field day challenging everything." "I know," James agreed. But what alternative do we have? The preliminary hearing is coming up and we have nothing. This child is suffering, Sarah. Every day that passes, she's withdrawing further into herself. If we do nothing, walks away, and Emma remains traumatized with no resolution. At least this way, we try something. Maybe it works. Maybe it doesn't, but doing nothing is definitely failing. Sarah sat quietly for a long moment, thinking through the implications. She looked at Dakota, at the dog's calm, intelligent face. She thought about that moment in the house on Maple Street when Emma's eyes had met Dakota's and something had shifted, however briefly. "Okay," she said finally, "but we need to do this carefully. We need to get proper authorization. We need to document everything. And we need to be prepared for this to not work." "Agreed," James said, relief flooding through him. "I was thinking we could approach Judge Morse. If we explain the situation and she approves it, we'd have judicial oversight. That would provide legal protection if we proceed." That evening, James drafted a detailed proposal for Judge Morse, explaining the impasse in the Emma case, the therapeutic potential of animal-assisted communication, and his carefully researched argument for why a supervised session with Officer Mitchell's K-9 partner might be the key to unlocking Emma's testimony. He included citations from peer-reviewed research, case studies of similar situations, and a detailed plan for how the session would be conducted and documented. Monday morning, James submitted the proposal through proper legal channels. He included a request for an emergency meeting with the judge to discuss the unconventional approach. Within hours, his phone rang. Judge Morse had approved the meeting for that same afternoon. James hung up the phone and exhaled slowly. They were about to take a leap into unknown territory, but for a little girl trapped behind a wall of trauma-induced silence, it was a leap worth taking. The morning of the session arrived with unexpected perfection. The Portland weather, typically unpredictable in late March, had blessed the day with clear skies and gentle warmth. Sarah Mitchell woke early, her mind already racing with the enormity of what lay ahead. She took extra care preparing Dakota that morning, brushing his coat until it gleamed, checking his nails, ensuring his collar and lead were pristine. The German shepherd seemed to sense something was different about today. He was attentive and calm, following Sarah's preparations with his characteristic intelligence. At the courthouse, Sarah walked the empty hallways, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The building felt different when it wasn't filled with the usual crush of attorneys, clients, and court staff. Quieter, more serious somehow. The conference room they had selected was located on the second floor, away from the main courtroom area. Judge Morse had specifically chosen it for its neutral, non-intimidating environment. It was a space typically used for mediation sessions. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, windows overlooking the courthouse's interior garden. Someone had thoughtfully placed a small table with water bottles and tissues, though everyone involved recognized that tissues might be needed for reasons having nothing to do with refreshment. Doctor arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled session time. She carried her professional clipboard, but her expression betrayed her nervousness about the unconventional nature of what they were about to attempt. She and Sarah had spoken several times over the phone about the session protocol. Doctor would be present to observe and document, but she would remain seated at a distance, positioned where she could see and hear everything but would not actively participate. The goal was to create a space where the only presences were Officer Sarah, Dakota, and Emma. Detective arrived with a camera operator who would record the session with Judge Morse's explicit permission. The recording was essential. If Emma did speak, they needed unambiguous documentation of her statements, made voluntarily and in her own words. The camera would be positioned to capture the room, but positioned behind Emma's line of sight so she would not feel directly observed or threatened by its presence. At 2 p.m. exactly, Jennifer arrived with Emma. The mother's face was a complex mixture of hope and anxiety. She had been briefed on the plan, and while she didn't fully understand how a dog could accomplish what trained psychologists could not, she was desperate enough to try anything. Emma, dressed in a pale pink dress with white sneakers, looked small and fragile as she held her mother's hand tightly. She had no idea what was about to happen or why she had been brought to this courthouse room, instead of to yet another appointment with another well-meaning adult who would ultimately fail to communicate with her. "Emma, sweetie," Jennifer said gently, kneeling down to her daughter's level. "Remember we talked about this. Officer Sarah and her special friend Dakota want to spend some time with you today. It's okay. You're safe here. Mommy will be right over there." She pointed to where Jennifer would sit in an adjacent area, close enough to provide visual comfort but far enough away to allow Emma space to interact with Sarah and Dakota without feeling her mother's anxious presence hovering over the interaction. Emma nodded slightly, though her grip on her mother's hand didn't loosen. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, scanning the unfamiliar room with the hypervigilance of a traumatized child assessing potential threats. Officer Sarah entered quietly, Dakota at her side. She had dressed casually, no police uniform, just regular clothes. She had deliberately chosen an outfit that was soft and non-threatening. When Emma saw Dakota, her eyes flickered with something that might have been recognition, memory, or simply the instinctive response that many young children have to animals. "Hi, Emma," Sarah said softly, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm so glad you could come today. Dakota wanted to see you. He's been thinking about you." It was a simple statement, but it was designed to do something specific, to shift the dynamic from adult to child, which inherently carried all the baggage of authority and interrogation, to a focus on the animal, on connection rather than questioning. Sarah settled herself on the floor of the room, Dakota beside her. She didn't pat the seat next to her or invite Emma to join. She simply sat, completely calm, and began gently stroking Dakota's fur in a rhythmic motion that was almost meditative. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Emma stood near her mother, watching. Dakota remained perfectly still, his breathing steady and gentle, his presence utterly non-threatening. Sarah spoke occasionally, not to Emma but seemingly to Dakota. She talked about the dog's favorite things, swimming in the park during summer, the taste of apple slices, the feeling of running through grass, how much he loved when people were kind and gentle with him. Then something shifted. Dakota, responding to impulses that only another being attuned to animal behavior might understand, released a soft whine. It wasn't a distress sound. It was something gentler, almost like a sigh. His head turned slightly toward Emma, and his dark eyes seemed to gaze directly at the little girl with an expression of pure compassion. Emma's grip on her mother's hand loosened slightly. She took one small step forward. "Dakota says hello," Sarah whispered softly, not looking at Emma, continuing to focus on the dog. "He's very happy you're here." Another moment passed. Then, with movements so tentative they were almost imperceptible, Emma released her mother's hand completely. She took a few small steps forward, moving closer to where Sarah and Dakota sat. Sarah maintained her completely calm demeanor, continuing to stroke Dakota's fur, not even looking at the approaching child. The lack of direct attention, the absence of the intense focus that Emma had experienced from every adult who had tried to help her, seemed to create space for something different to happen. Emma lowered herself to the floor, still several feet away from Dakota, but now sitting rather than standing, now physically at the same level as the dog and the officer. For the first time, she was voluntarily joining the space rather than being directed into it. Sarah waited. She had been coached extensively on the importance of patience, on understanding that children who had experienced trauma needed to set the pace of interaction. Pushing, even gently, could trigger the same defensive mechanisms that had created Emma's selective mutism in the first place. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, Emma reached one small hand forward. Dakota, with the gentleness of an animal that had extensive training in therapeutic work, stood and took a few steps toward the girl. He did not jump or playfully pounce as many dogs might. He moved with deliberate slowness, allowing Emma complete control over the interaction. Emma's fingers made contact with Dakota's fur. Her small hand, which had been curled into a fist moments before, relaxed against the dog's coat. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid with anxiety, began to deepen. "Dakota really likes you," Sarah said softly, still not making direct eye contact with Emma, still maintaining that gentle, non-demanding tone. "He can feel that you need a friend right now. He's very good at being a friend when people are sad or scared." Emma's hand continued to stroke Dakota's fur. Her mouth moved slightly, as if she were about to speak, but nothing emerged. Sarah waited, demonstrating through her own body language and her complete absence of pressure that this was Emma's process, at Emma's pace, on Emma's terms. Then, barely audible, so quiet that the audio equipment had to be adjusted to capture it, Emma's voice emerged. "You're nice," she whispered to Dakota. "You don't yell." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Doctor, sitting across the room, felt tears spring to her eyes. Detective, watching through the recording equipment, immediately straightened, recognizing that they had just crossed a threshold they had been unable to breach for weeks. But Sarah didn't react with obvious triumph or relief. She simply continued stroking Dakota's fur with the same gentle rhythm, as if Emma had said nothing unusual, as if this moment wasn't completely pivotal to the entire case. "Dakota doesn't yell," Sarah confirmed quietly. "He just listens and cares about people." Emma leaned closer to the dog, her small body now pressed against Dakota's side. She began to speak, her words still whispered but becoming slightly more confident. Speaking not to Officer Sarah, not to any adult, but to the dog who had somehow created a safe space where her trapped voice could finally emerge. "Daddy yells really loud," Emma whispered. "He yells so loud, and he says mean things. He says I'm bad. He says Mommy doesn't love me. I don't like when he yells. It makes my heart hurt." In the corner of the room, Detective felt something shift in his chest, the immense weight of a breakthrough, the moment when a seemingly impossible case suddenly became possible. But more than that, he felt the profound relief of knowing that this child, this traumatized little girl, had found her voice again. Not through any adult's expertise or training, but through the simple, unconditional presence of a gentle animal who asked nothing of her except to be herself. The session continued for another 45 minutes, and with each passing moment, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Emma remained curled against Dakota's warm body, her small fingers never ceasing their gentle stroking of the dog's soft fur. The physical contact with the animal seemed to ground her, to create a safe anchor from which she could venture into the painful territories of her trauma and fear. Speaking to Dakota rather than to any human in the room, Emma's narrative began to unfold in the fragmented, non-linear way that young children often recount their experiences. There was no chronological order to her revelations, no neat, organized sequence of events. Instead, her memories seemed to bubble up in waves, sometimes triggered by something Dakota did, sometimes emerging spontaneously as her confidence grew with each witnessed response of non-judgment from the gentle animal. "Daddy said don't tell Mommy our secret," Emma whispered, her voice gaining slightly more volume as she continued. "He said if I tell Mommy, she won't love me anymore. He said she already doesn't love me very much. He said that's why she gives me to him sometimes." Doctor, sitting across the room with her clipboard, felt her jaw clench. This was classic psychological manipulation, a parent weaponizing a child's fundamental need for maternal love, using it as leverage to enforce silence and obedience. She wrote rapid notes, documenting Emma's exact words, noting the time, capturing every detail for the clinical record. "When did Daddy say these things?" Sarah asked gently, still not making direct eye contact with Emma, keeping her focus on Dakota while allowing her voice to remain in the conversation. The technique was brilliant in its simplicity. By not demanding Emma's direct attention, by allowing her to speak to the dog while an adult listened nearby, Sarah had created a space where Emma could process her trauma without the psychological pressure of interrogation. "He says it lots of times," Emma continued, her words tumbling out now with increasing momentum, as if a dam had broken and years of suppressed communication were flooding through. "Every time I go to his house, he says I'm not being very good. He says I'm bad. He says other kids are better than me. He says I'm stupid." The clinical evidence of emotional abuse was mounting with each statement. These were not accusations of a single incident. This was a pattern, a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation designed to control and isolate the child from her mother while damaging her self-concept and sense of worth. "He told me not to tell Mommy about our special secret," Emma said again, and this phrase clearly held particular significance in her memory. She repeated it several times, as if the phrase itself was traumatic, as if understanding what this special secret actually was might have been the breakthrough moment that finally broke her silence. "What was the special secret, sweetheart?" Sarah asked softly, still maintaining her calm, unhurried tone. Emma's body tensed slightly against Dakota. Her hand continued stroking the dog, but her rhythm became slightly irregular, jerky. This was clearly difficult terrain for her to navigate, even with the comfort of the animal's presence. "That's when he doesn't touch me in the bad ways like I heard kids talk about at school," Emma said carefully, as if she had rehearsed these words in her mind many times but had never been able to speak them aloud. "But he says mean things, and he says I'm his special girl, and I shouldn't tell Mommy about being his special girl because it would make her jealous and sad." Sarah's expression didn't change, but internally she was processing this revelation with cold clarity. What Emma was describing wasn't physical sexual abuse, but it was psychological manipulation of a sexually concerning nature, an adult creating an inappropriate special relationship with a child, using isolation and secrecy as tools of control, and weaponizing the child's confusion about boundaries and appropriate relationships. Doctor's hand trembled slightly as she continued writing. This information was crucial. It explained so much about Emma's trauma response, her inability to trust adults, her selective mutism. The child had been placed in an impossible psychological bind. Speaking the truth would risk losing her mother's love. Remaining silent meant continuing to endure the emotional abuse and manipulation. "That sounds very scary," Sarah said quietly, "and very confusing. I think you were very brave to tell Dakota about this." Emma looked up at Sarah for the first time, their eyes making direct contact. In that moment, something shifted in the little girl's expression. She saw not judgment, not anger, not blame. She saw acceptance and validation. She saw an adult who believed her, who didn't think she was bad or stupid or unworthy. The session continued, with Emma gradually revealing more details about her interactions with her father. She described how he would tell her things that didn't make sense to her young mind, how he would say her mother was selfish and didn't really want to spend time with her, how he would tell her that she needed to be his special girl, so he would have someone who loved him because her mother didn't, how he would create situations where Emma felt responsible for his emotional and his happiness. It was textbook emotional abuse and psychological manipulation. It wasn't dramatic or obviously violent, which perhaps was why it had been so difficult for the other professionals to address. There were no visible injuries, no obvious signs of physical harm, but the psychological damage was profound and extensive. After nearly an hour, Emma's words began to slow. She was tired, emotionally exhausted from the effort of finally expressing what had been locked inside her for so long. Dakota, sensing her fatigue, shifted his position slightly and gently placed his head on her lap. Emma wrapped both her arms around the dog's neck, holding him close. "I didn't want to be his special girl," Emma whispered one final time. "I wanted him to be like a normal daddy. I wanted him to be nice like Dakota." The room fell silent. Doctor continued to write, documenting everything with meticulous care. Detective, watching through the recording equipment, knew they now had what they needed. Not just fragments of trauma, but a coherent, detailed account of systematic psychological abuse and manipulation perpetrated by a parent against his own child. After a few more minutes, Sarah gently suggested that Emma might want to rest, that they could stop for now. Emma reluctantly released her hold on Dakota, but didn't resist. Sarah walked her back to Jennifer, who immediately enveloped her daughter in a careful, protective embrace. Jennifer's face was streaked with tears, her jaw clenched with the combination of vindication and horror that comes with finally understanding the full extent of harm done to your child. In the hallway outside the conference room, doctor, detective, and officer Sarah convened for a brief debriefing. The recording equipment was still processing, ensuring that every word, every moment had been captured with perfect clarity. "This is comprehensive psychological abuse," Doctor said, her professional voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "What she described goes beyond simple parental conflict. This is a pattern of systematic manipulation, isolation from her mother, inappropriate boundary setting, and emotional control. Combined with the secrecy component and the sexualized nature of the special relationship framing, this presents as a clear case of child psychological abuse." Detective nodded, his expression grim but determined. "We have documentation. We have her statements on video. We have your clinical assessment. This is something we can work with, something we can build a case around." "She was extraordinarily brave," Sarah said quietly, looking back toward the door where Emma was recovering in her mother's arms. "She found her voice when she needed to most." The three professionals stood in the hallway, each understanding the magnitude of what had just occurred. A child who had been silenced by fear and manipulation had found the courage to speak her truth. And in speaking that truth to a gentle animal and the compassionate humans who had understood that sometimes the most direct routes to healing wind through the most unconventional paths, Emma had provided the crucial testimony that would change the trajectory of her life and the legal case that would determine her future. The video recording of Emma's session with Dakota was delivered to the court precisely 48 hours after it had been made. Detective personally walked it to Judge Morse's chambers, understanding the delicate legal ground they now occupied. The recording was potentially explosive evidence, powerful, emotionally compelling, and completely unprecedented in its methodology. That was exactly what made it legally precarious. Attorney, a sharp and experienced defense lawyer named Robert, received notice of the video evidence with barely concealed outrage. He immediately filed a motion challenging the admissibility of the recording, arguing that it violated multiple legal standards and constitutional protections. His argument was multi-pronged and sophisticated. The statements were hearsay, never properly cross-examined. The use of a therapy animal constituted coercive influence on a vulnerable witness. The interview lacked proper Miranda warnings and legal safeguards. The methodology was not scientifically validated and had never been tested in a court of law before. And the entire session had been conducted in a manner that was designed to produce emotional testimony rather than reliable evidence. "Your Honor," argued in a heated preliminary hearing, "what we have here is a coached, manipulated statement from a 4-year-old child who was in an emotionally heightened state. The presence of a therapy animal created an artificial emotional environment specifically designed to elicit testimony. This is not evidence. This is psychological engineering masquerading as criminal investigation." The courtroom buzzed with activity. The case had attracted media attention. The unusual methodology had caught the interest of local news outlets, and there were now reporters in the gallery taking detailed notes. Judge Morse sat on the bench, her expression carefully neutral, listening with the intensity of someone fully aware they were making a decision that would likely be appealed and scrutinized at multiple legal levels. Detective sat in the front row, his jaw clenched as he listened to assault on the methodology he and Sarah had so carefully developed. Beside him, Doctor prepared her response, her professional expertise about to be tested in a courtroom arena where legal standards, not clinical standards, would ultimately prevail. The statements made by the child were entirely voluntary, Dr. when called to the stand. There was no coercion, no leading questions, no attempt to put words in the child's mouth. Officer Mitchell specifically avoided directly questioning the child. The child chose to communicate. The presence of the therapy dog did not create false testimony. It created a psychological environment safe enough for the child to express what she had already experienced and remembered. Cross-examination was merciless. Doctor, is it not true that animals can be used to manipulate emotional responses in human subjects? That's a gross oversimplification, replied carefully. Animals can provide comfort, but they cannot create false memories or manufacture trauma responses that don't exist. But couldn't a skilled manipulator use an animal's calming presence to encourage a child to say things she might not otherwise say? Pressed. The child's statements were consistent with her prior behavior patterns, her documented anxiety symptoms, and the pattern of what Child Protective Services had observed, countered. These were not coached statements. These were the natural expression of a traumatized child finally feeling safe enough to communicate. Officer Sarah Mitchell was called to testify about the specifics of the session, her training with Dakota, the deliberate non-directive nature of her interactions, her explicit avoidance of leading questions or suggestions. She described the 45 minutes of careful patience, of allowing Emma to set the pace, of never pressuring or coercing. Attacked her credibility relentlessly. Isn't it true, Officer Mitchell, that you and Detective conspired to use an unconventional method specifically because traditional investigation had failed? We used a therapeutic approach, Sarah responded calmly, because conventional approaches had not been successful. The child was in distress and unable to communicate. We explored an alternative based on research into trauma-informed practices. And isn't it convenient that this unconventional method produced exactly the evidence your investigation needed? Suggested pointedly. The evidence produced is what the child disclosed, Sarah said firmly. We didn't create her experiences. We simply provided an environment where she felt safe enough to express them. The hearing extended over 3 days. Jennifer about her concerns regarding behavior toward Emma, about her attempts to get Emma to disclose what was happening, about her professional evaluation of her daughter's trauma symptoms. She spoke about her relief at finally understanding why Emma had shut down, and her profound sadness at learning the extent of the psychological manipulation her ex-partner had perpetrated on their child. Himself took the stand in his own defense, a risky but calculated move. He everything categorically. He claimed that he had never said the things Emma described, that he was a loving father being maligned by an ex-partner seeking revenge through custody manipulation. He argued that Emma had been coached by her mother and then further manipulated during the questionable therapy dog session. His testimony was composed and articulate. He was a sympathetic figure in many ways, a father claiming to be a victim of parental alienation. But then Detective presented additional evidence, text messages between and Jennifer from months before the incident, in which controlling language and emotional manipulation were evident. Records from Emma's documenting her anxiety and behavioral changes correlating with visitation periods. Testimony from Jennifer's therapist about Jennifer's documentation of concerning behavioral changes in Emma following visits with her father. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but the fundamental issue remained: the admissibility of the video recording. Judge Morse was clearly struggling with the decision. She had sympathy for Emma's plight, but she also had obligations to constitutional protections and legal precedent. Finally, on the third afternoon of the hearing, she issued her ruling. The court acknowledges the unprecedented nature of the methodology employed in obtaining the child's statements, Judge Morse said carefully from the bench. While this court recognizes the trauma-informed approach and the genuine care taken by the investigating officers, this court also recognizes the validity of concerns about admissibility. Therefore, the video recording will be admitted into evidence, but with specific limitations. The statements will be considered circumstantial evidence and will be weighted accordingly. They will not constitute direct testimony in the traditional sense, as the child has not been subject to cross-examination in a formal legal setting. However, corroborating evidence from social services, behavioral documentation, and expert testimony regarding trauma patterns will be admissible. It was a compromise decision, not a complete victory, but not a defeat either. The video would be part of the evidentiary record, but the court was signaling that it would view the evidence with appropriate caution, requiring additional corroboration before making final determinations. Judge Morse then issued a series of immediate protective orders. Unsupervised custody was suspended indefinitely pending further investigation. Visitation would be supervised only, with a neutral third party present. A comprehensive psychological evaluation was ordered for both Emma and Jennifer was granted temporary primary custody, and the case was set for a full custody hearing to take place in 60 days. This court takes seriously the protection of children, Judge Morse said from the bench. While the methodology employed in obtaining this evidence is novel and will likely face scrutiny, the of the child must be our paramount concern. This court finds sufficient concern regarding the child's safety to warrant the protective measures outlined above. Outside the courtroom, his attorney immediately announced that the ruling was unjust and that they would appeal the decision. The media descended on the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Detective and Officer Sarah stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, aware that they had won a round but that the battle was far from over. In a quiet room inside the courthouse, Emma sat with her mother, watching a children's movie with Dakota resting his head on her lap. The dog had been allowed to remain with her throughout the proceedings, providing the emotional support that had made her breakthrough possible. Jennifer stroked her daughter's hair gently, watching as the tension in the little girl's body gradually released. The legal battle was intensifying, but Emma had already won the most important victory. She had found her voice, and the world was finally beginning to listen. The 60 days between the preliminary hearing and the full custody hearing passed with agonizing slowness. The psychological evaluations had been completed, comprehensive assessments conducted by independent evaluators chosen by the court to ensure neutrality. The evaluators interviewed both Emma and separately, observed their interactions during supervised visitation, reviewed the complete medical and behavioral history of both the child and the father. The results were damning for. The psychological evaluation of Emma revealed extensive trauma symptoms consistent with emotional abuse and psychological manipulation, significant anxiety, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting adults, negative self-perception, and behavioral regression. The evaluator noted that Emma's trauma presentation was not consistent with a single incident, but rather with prolonged, systematic exposure to manipulative and emotionally harmful behaviors. The evaluator stated clearly in her report, "This child exhibits symptoms consistent with complex trauma resulting from prolonged psychological abuse by a parental figure." The evaluation of revealed concerning personality patterns, narcissistic traits, lack of emotional regulation, controlling behaviors, and what the evaluator termed concerning boundary issues with respect to age-appropriate relationships with his child. The report noted that demonstrated limited insight into the impact of his behavior on his daughter, and showed a pattern of minimization and deflection when confronted with feedback about his parenting practices. The morning of the full custody hearing arrived gray and drizzly, typical Portland, weather finally returning after the unusual warmth of the previous weeks. The courthouse was packed. The case had garnered significant media attention, and journalists from local news outlets filled the gallery. This was not just another custody dispute. It was a landmark case involving unprecedented methodologies and questions about the future of child advocacy in the legal system. Judge Morse entered the courtroom with an expression of absolute seriousness. She had reviewed all the evidence, read every report, studied the psychology literature that had been submitted by both sides. She had also received an unusual visitor the evening before. Officer Sarah Mitchell and Detective James had requested a brief meeting with her to discuss Emma's current condition and the child's continued need for therapeutic support and stability. Jennifer sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, a competent family law specialist named Rachel. Sat at the defendant's table with Robert, his defense attorney, who was preparing for what he clearly believed would be a vigorous legal battle. But the evidence presented during the hearing was remarkably one-sided. The prosecution called witness after witness who corroborated the pattern of abuse. Emma's director about Emma's behavioral changes, her anxiety spikes following visitation days with, her gradual improvement since the protective orders had been implemented. The school's psychologist about Emma's regression and recovery trajectory. Emma's therapist provided clinical testimony about the documented nature of Emma's trauma. Then came the presentation of the video. Judge Morse had requested that the full 45-minute recording be played for the court record. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as Emma's voice, small and tentative at first, then gradually gaining confidence and clarity, described her experiences. The silence was profound, an almost physical presence in the room. Journalists stopped taking notes. Even the court bailiff seemed to hold his breath. When Emma's voice came through the speaker saying, "He said I'm stupid and nobody likes me. He said I'm bad," the emotional weight of the moment seemed to press down on everyone present. Attempted his cross-examination strategy, trying to plant seeds of doubt about Emma's reliability, suggesting the statements had been influenced by the therapeutic setting, implying that Jennifer had coached her daughter. But Judge Morse interrupted him. "Counsel," the judge said firmly, "the admissibility parameters have already been established. The weight given to this evidence will be determined by this court based on the totality of the evidence, including the corroborating testimony and evaluations that have been presented." The psychological evaluations were presented in detail. Doctor about the clinical significance of Emma's trauma presentation. The independent evaluator about the alarming nature of his personality profile and the concerning boundaries reflected in his relationship with his daughter. The director described specific incidents in which Emma had become anxious before visitation days and exhibited behavioral regression after returning from her father's home. Took the stand again, trying to rehabilitate his image, claiming that the evaluations were biased, that the psychological assessment was conducted by someone predisposed to find him guilty. He maintained that he had done nothing wrong, that Emma had been manipulated by her mother, that this entire proceeding was a travesty of justice. But when asked direct questions about whether he had ever made negative comments to Emma about her mother, whether he had ever told Emma she was bad or stupid, whether he had ever created a special relationship dynamic that excluded her mother, answers became evasive and contradictory. His testimony essentially undercut his own defense, revealing the controlling behaviors that the evaluations had documented. The final hours of testimony came from Jennifer. She spoke about her observations of Emma's changes, about her concerns regarding his behavior, about her relief at finally understanding what had been causing her daughter's distress. She spoke about her commitment to Emma's recovery and about her willingness to facilitate a healthy relationship between Emma and her father if would engage in appropriate therapeutic intervention to address his behavioral patterns. Judge Morse took a brief recess before delivering her verdict. Everyone understood that what was about to be decided would shape the trajectory of Emma's entire childhood, her sense of safety, her ability to heal from trauma. When the judge returned to the bench, her expression was grave. She took several minutes to summarize the evidence, to articulate the legal standards she was applying, to explain her reasoning. Finally, she arrived at her determination. This court finds, based on the preponderance of the evidence, that the child, Emma, has been subjected to emotional abuse and psychological manipulation by her father. The evidence demonstrates a pattern of behavior designed to control the child, isolate her from her mother, manipulate her sense of self-worth, and create an inappropriate dependency relationship. While this court recognizes the novelty of the methodology used to obtain the child's statements, this court finds that the statements are corroborated by extensive collateral evidence, professional evaluations, behavioral documentation, and expert testimony. Judge Morse continued, her voice steady and authoritative. The court must prioritize the best interests and safety of the child. Based on the totality of the evidence presented, this court determines that unsupervised custody with the father presents a significant risk of continued psychological harm to the child. She issued her final ruling, would have supervised visitation only, limited to 4 hours per week with a court-appointed supervisor present. Jennifer was granted primary custody with the authority to make all major decisions regarding Emma's education, medical care, and therapeutic treatment. Was ordered to complete a comprehensive program addressing parenting skills, emotional regulation, and boundary issues, with no advancement toward unsupervised visitation until he completed the program and demonstrated sustained behavioral change. Therapy for Emma was ordered and would be paid for by, and a review hearing would be conducted in 1 year to assess compliance and progress. The courtroom erupted. Jennifer wept with relief and vindication, face flushed with anger and denial. Media cameras flashed. Reporters rushed to file their stories about the unprecedented case and its decisive outcome. In a quiet side room, Emma sat with Dakota, not fully understanding the legal terminology but sensing the fundamental shift in the proceedings. Officer Sarah had arranged for Dakota to be present throughout the hearing, providing Emma with the emotional anchor that had made her testimony possible. The little girl stroked the dog's fur gently, her face showing the first genuine smile that anyone had witnessed since the entire ordeal had begun. Justice, finally and unambiguously, had been served. Not perfectly. The legal system rarely delivers perfect outcomes, but decisively and with Emma's safety and clearly placed at the center of the determination. A child who had been silenced by trauma, manipulation, and fear had spoken through the most unconventional of intermediaries. And a community of professionals, united by their commitment to child protection and supported by judicial courage, had listened. 6 months after Judge Morse's ruling, Emma sat in her kindergarten classroom, her small hand carefully tracing letters on a worksheet, her concentration absolute. Ms., her kindergarten teacher, watched the little girl with quiet satisfaction. Emma had come to this classroom still carrying the weight of her trauma, anxious, withdrawn, hesitant to interact with peers. But over the past half-year, something remarkable had happened. Slowly, incrementally, Emma had begun to blossom. The transformation hadn't been overnight. Healing from trauma, even with the best therapeutic support, was a gradual process. But the protective orders from the court, combined with consistent therapy and the unwavering support of her mother, had created the foundation Emma needed to begin the long journey toward recovery. Emma had started kindergarten 2 weeks after the court hearing. On her first day, she had clung to her mother's leg, reluctant to leave the safety of Jennifer's presence. But Jennifer, working closely with Emma's therapist, Dr., had followed a carefully constructed plan to help Emma develop confidence and trust in new environments and new adults. Each day brought small steps forward. Emma stayed in the classroom for an additional 15 minutes. Emma participated in a group activity. Emma made a comment to another child. Emma volunteered an answer in class. By the 2nd month of kindergarten, Emma had made her first friend, a girl named Sophie who loved drawing pictures of animals. By the 3rd month, Emma was laughing in the classroom, engaging in imaginative play and showing enthusiasm for learning. Her teacher noted in her progress reports that Emma's anxiety remained evident in certain situations, particularly in transitions and unfamiliar settings, but that the girl was showing remarkable resilience and growing confidence. The therapeutic support Emma received was comprehensive and carefully coordinated. She had individual therapy sessions with Doctor twice weekly, in which the therapist worked on processing her trauma, developing healthy coping mechanisms, and rebuilding her sense of self-worth. The therapy sessions incorporated play therapy, art therapy, and talk therapy, multiple modalities designed to reach a child through different channels of expression and processing. Crucially, Officer Sarah Mitchell had arranged for Emma to have monthly therapeutic sessions with Dakota. These sessions, conducted at a neutral facility designed specifically for animal-assisted therapy, had become the highlight of Emma's month. During these sessions, Emma would sit with Dakota, sometimes talking about her feelings and experiences, sometimes simply being present with the dog in companionable silence. The sessions served a dual purpose. They provided Emma with continued access to the animal that had helped her find her voice, and they reinforced the message that she was safe, that her voice mattered, and that her experiences were valid. "Emma loves those sessions," Jennifer told Doctor during one of their collaborative meetings. "She looks forward to them all month. There's something about Dakota that continues to help her in ways I don't fully understand, but I can see the effects. She's calmer afterward. She seems more confident." Doctor nodded understandingly. Animals can provide what humans sometimes cannot: unconditional acceptance, non-judgmental presence, and a bridge to emotional expression that bypasses some of the defensive mechanisms trauma creates. Emma was able to speak to Dakota when she couldn't speak to any human. That fundamental experience of being heard, even by an animal, seems to have opened pathways for her to be heard by people as well. Jennifer had also been working with her own therapist, processing the trauma of realizing that her ex-partner had psychologically abused their daughter, coming to terms with the guilt of not having recognized it sooner, and rebuilding her own sense of competence as a parent. The therapist had helped her understand that the abuse was not her fault, that she had responded appropriately once the truth emerged, and that her commitment to Emma's recovery was the most important factor in her daughter's healing. The supervised visitation, which had been a complicated piece of the recovery puzzle, had initially been angry and resistant to the court orders, but gradually, as weeks turned to months, something had shifted. The parenting program he was required to complete, a comprehensive intervention focused on emotional regulation, healthy boundary setting, and trauma-informed parenting, had apparently begun to penetrate his defensive armor. A trained supervisor attended each 4-hour visitation session, and their reports gradually began to show improvement in demeanor and approach to Emma. During the early supervised visits, Emma had been understandably anxious. She would cling to the supervisor, would speak to her father in monosyllables, would count the minutes until the session ended. But the supervisor was experienced in working with traumatized children and had helped create structure and safety during the visits. They established consistent routines, clear boundaries, and regular check-ins where Emma could express how she was feeling. By month 4 of the supervised visitation arrangement, something subtle but significant had changed. Emma still showed some anxiety, but it was noticeably reduced. She began to engage her father in simple activities: coloring, playing board games, reading books together. The supervisor noted in her reports that seemed to be making genuine efforts to engage with Emma in age-appropriate ways without attempting manipulation or inappropriate emotional control. During one visit, Emma had told her father that she had made a friend at school named Sophie. Instead of redirecting the conversation back to himself or making negative comments about Emma's mother, had responded with genuine interest, asking Emma questions about her friend, listening to her answers. It was a small moment, but it represented the kind of behavioral shift that the parenting program was designed to create. Detective James had moved on to other cases, but he remained informally connected to Emma's situation. He would occasionally check in with Officer Sarah or Doctor to see how Emma was progressing. He had presented the Emma case at a law enforcement conference, and it had generated significant interest and discussion about alternative approaches to interviewing traumatized children. Several police departments had subsequently begun training officers in trauma-informed interview techniques and exploring the potential of animal-assisted communication. Officer Sarah and Dakota had become regular presences in Emma's life. Beyond the formal therapeutic sessions, Sarah would occasionally stop by Emma's school for assemblies or community events, and Dakota would participate in demonstrations about police K-9 work. Emma would always come running when she saw the dog, and the public displays of affection between the child and the German Shepherd never failed to move observers who understood the backstory. One afternoon, about 8 months after the court hearing, Officer Sarah received an unexpected invitation. Emma's school was planning a special assembly to recognize community helpers, and Emma's teacher had specifically requested that Officer Sarah and Dakota be included in the program. Emma had asked if Dakota could come visit her school. The assembly was held in the school gymnasium, with parents, teachers, and students gathered to honor the firefighters, paramedics, police officers, and community volunteers who work to keep their neighborhoods safe. When Officer Sarah and Dakota were introduced, Emma stood and applauded enthusiastically, her entire face radiant with pride and affection. After the formal program ended, she ran directly to Dakota and hugged the dog, then hugged Officer Sarah. "Dakota is my best friend," Emma announced loudly enough for the surrounding parents and teachers to hear. "Dakota helped me find my voice." The statement was simple, honest, and profound. The adults around her seemed to understand, on some level, that this child and this animal had shared something significant, something that transcended the usual relationship between a pet and a child. By the 1-year mark after the court hearing, Emma had transformed into a confident, resilient kindergartner who loved school, had a group of friends, participated actively in class, and showed no signs of the selective mutism that had once defined her traumatic response. She still had difficult moments. Anniversaries of traumatic events sometimes triggered anxiety, transitions continued to be challenging, and she remained somewhat cautious with unfamiliar adults. These were normal residual effects of trauma, manageable with continued therapeutic support. Jennifer reported that Emma was sleeping through the night without nightmares, had regained her bladder control after the regression caused by early trauma, and was engaging in normal childhood activities with enthusiasm and joy. She had even begun to talk about her experiences in age-appropriate ways, processing what had happened while simultaneously moving forward in her development. The case of Emma and Dakota became more than just a custody dispute resolved through unconventional means. It became a symbol of what was possible when a community of professionals, police officers, social workers, psychologists, judges, and a remarkable dog, united around a commitment to protecting a child and believing in her voice, even when that voice had been lost to trauma. The therapeutic methodology pioneered in Emma's case began to be adopted in other jurisdictions. Training programs started incorporating animal-assisted therapy into their curricula for child advocates and law enforcement professionals. Academic papers were published analyzing the effectiveness of the approach. While not every case could be solved through such methods, it had opened a door to possibilities that had previously seemed impossible. And at the center of it all, a little girl named Emma continued to grow, to laugh, to play, and to discover that the world, despite its capacity to hurt her, also held kindness, healing, and the unconditional love of a gentle dog who had helped her find her voice when she needed it most.